So I don't sit there with some moral outrage and being offended by it, because it isn't my football club, and the deal has already been done, the die's been cast, and that ship has sailed. Welcome to this week's edition of One to One with Simon Jordan. Don't forget to keep liking and subscribing, and of course, equally as importantly, keep leaving your questions in the comment section below. But let's get on with this week's show. Chelsea get a free ride on anything? Not really. Chelsea have just been sanctioned, and their owner drop-kicked into oblivion for obvious reasons because of his association and a change of ownership. No, they've been criticised. Their form has been poor this season. People like me believe that they would win a league and have been quite critical of them. The LUKAKU situation was beyond their gift to handle, because you can't legislate for a player purporting to want to come back to a club and then the moment he doesn't get what he wants, going on air and behaving in a fashion which almost brings the club into disrepute. So I don't think Chelsea get a pass. I think sometimes when it comes to the allegations of the way that the finances in the game are going, with people like Manchester City and Paris Saint-Germain and possibly Newcastle, people seem to forget that Chelsea were one of the lightning rods for how finances in the game would change. And I've always made the point that one of the worst things that could have happened to football, not Chelsea, but to football, was Roman Abramovich and his explosion of cash, which caused massive inflation in the game. But as far as performance is concerned, well, Chelsea cannot be heralded as having done a great season last year. They got to 2 finals, they lost them both. They didn't really pull up that many trees in either the Champions League as defending champions or the Premier League, where there was a huge expectation that Lukaku was going to be the cherry on top of the particular cake. So I don't think they get a pass. I just think the conversation moves away from Chelsea onto the Man Cities and Liverpools of the world. And sometimes if someone isn't talking about a football club, it's because they're not that relevant. And Chelsea sort of fell into a void where Tottenham's with Conte were rebuilding themselves, Arsenal with Arteta were rebuilding themselves, Liverpool and Man City were dominating and all the narrative was around them. And then there was Chelsea, which is actually more disappointing. So I'm not sure for Chelsea fans and for Chelsea as a football club, because they weren't really talked about that much. There was more conversation about how their owner was being forced to give a football club away and what the new ownership model looks like. So I don't know if that's the answer to the question, Jackie, but that is an answer. I think Nick Kyrgios is an immensely talented tennis player, but tragically, I think with such talent sometimes comes an alternate side, which is his box office. There's no doubt. There's times when his play is absolute genius and his antics on the court are funny, and there are times when his behaviour is unacceptable. I don't think he was wrong necessarily to challenge the line judges or to challenge the umpire. I think the narrative that he was advancing and the rhetoric he was using was childish and immature, but sometimes pressure and expectation brings that out in a player. I'm not trying to excuse it. It's existed in tennis for a long time. There's been plenty of players like Ilan Nastase, Jimmy Connors, John McEnroe, to name but a few, that have had a temperament that sometimes has boiled over, and the argument would be that these guys went on and won things, and Kyrgios doesn't. And Kyrgios has a lot to say about other people and has some hypocrisy in his positioning. And there's a lot of Australians that think he is a bit of a tool, but there's also a lot of people that think he is a very gifted player. I'm in the gifted player camp. I didn't like his attitude yesterday. I didn't like the fact that he spat in the general direction of a member of the public. I didn't like his observations that people criticised him, so it gave him some form of entitlement, because it kind of makes me feel that with these elite sports people, albeit he's never won a Grand Slam and has only ever got to 13th in the world, which by the way is fantastic, but with his talent should be even greater, and perhaps the attitude that he has explains the reasons why he hasn't won a slam and hasn't gotten any into the top 10 in the world when he has the ability to do it. And his attitude sort of embodies a sense of entitlement that you can't be criticised, you can only be praised, and fans can't boo you, that they can only cheer you. And of course I understand that when you've got a player playing against a British player in a very partisan environment like Wimbledon, it will create its own dynamic. But you can't go into press conferences and be as seemingly arrogant and cocky. I mean, I'm not a fan even though I operate in the media, of certain segments of the media and journalists thinking they have an entitlement to ask the most ludicrous questions. So I do get some of the situation, but I don't think he's a clown. I think he has a lot of opinions. I think he has a lot of double standards. I think he's a phenomenal tennis player that perhaps looked back on his career and realised that he wasted a lot of opportunities. But with great talent, sometimes comes a sort of mercurial, flawed genius perspective, and it was just a shame that he hasn't got wins to back up some of the notoriety that he's got. What do I make of Newcastle's kit being the spitting image of an ownership model? Well, I make very little of it because I don't think it's surprising. First and foremost, Newcastle have had other kits that have resembled something similar to this in the past. So of course this is going to be uploaded into an observation by parts of the media that here we go. But let's be clear, whether Newcastle fans like it or not, this club is owned by the state. PIF is a fund that's owned by Mohammed bin Salman, who is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. The argument was never ever about separation, because the Newcastle fans make it that we were being blocked from owning a football club because of the prejudice to our nation state. Well, that's not a rule. There's no rule that stops people from owning a football club because they're a nation state. There is a rule that people don't want people that own football clubs to have been involved in piracy. And the reasons why there was an issue with the ownership model was because there was clear indications of piracy sanctioned by Saudi laws that Mohammed bin Salman was involved in advocating for, which means you can't sue under copyright. And the moment the Saudis copped to piracy and dealt with Bian, then all of a sudden the deal gets waved through and we get this ridiculous observation of a separation of powers was what the Premier League was happy with in terms of ownership models. And that was really more to do with people like Amnesty International putting pressure on a regime that owns a football club that has a history of human rights issues. But I don't make anything of the kit. I don't make anything of it. It's that ship has sailed. We have allowed it to go through, and people can make a big deal out of it. But Newcastle is owned by a Middle Eastern consortium, a Middle Eastern ownership model, which is a state-owned investment fund. And I'm not surprised that a kit resembles the kit of the national team, that the country that the ownership model comes from. So I don't sit there with some moral outrage and being offended by it, because it isn't my football club and the deal has already been done, the die's been cast and that ship has sailed. I don't think that we will not, or we will see a female manager in men's football. I hope that the determining factor will not be someone's sex, it'll be their ability. You know, whether it's because someone is good enough should be the only determination. This argument that rages about Emma Hayes and people becoming entrenched in their positions about whether she should get a job in men's football or she shouldn't. She should get a job in men's football because she's capable of managing at that level. Whilst we discuss the parameters of men's and women's football, there is a vast difference in the technical ability of male players currently and female players. The gap is becoming less, but it still exists. And this idea that Emma Hayes, because she's managing a group of elite women players, and let's be clear, one of the best international teams in women's football is the Americans, who got beat by an under-15s boys team recently, which is not me trying to disparage women's football, it's trying to get some context as to where it is at this moment in time. And taking Emma Hayes, who has done a fabulous job with Chelsea's women's team, playing in front of average gates of 3,000 or 4,000 fans, is vastly different than managing a men's team with a far greater level of expectation, I believe technical ability, pressure, awareness. But to go to the original question, if a woman is good enough to manage a men's football team, then absolutely that should happen, and absolutely there should be an opportunity, and absolutely equal opportunity should be provided. But it has to be based upon talent and not based upon some ridiculous notion that it's a must-do thing. With the downward momentum, I think probably a limited amount of time, the government have recently come out and saying they're going to give guidelines to suggest that maybe football clubs should consider their position without a directive, because the football clubs will push back and say, how can you take away such big revenue streams post a pandemic when the industry's lost so much money. And then the other side of the argument will be, well, human lives are at stake here, because clearly this is a situation where people are suffering from gambling addictions, and brands like football clubs that are so influential appearing to endorse it and to support it causes consternation, and the next generation of football fans are being confronted with gambling as a stable diet. But if the government got its act together, regulated the gambling industries better, made the minimum age higher, made credit controls, made cross-referencing between the betting companies, so you can't run a credit limit at one betting company and one at another, then maybe, just maybe, you wouldn't have to take away a legitimate advertising spend from football clubs in the betting community by saying now that you have to ban betting companies from being able to advertise or endorse a football club. See, I have a moving mindset on salary caps. I think that ultimately to put controls into place to make football clubs sustainable businesses rather than dependent upon owners is a good move. But also I believe in investment in businesses. So I have been a major advocate for salary caps, and a salary cap being something like 70% of your turnover means that if Manchester United's turnover is 500 million pounds, they'd have a 350 million pound salary cap. If Crystal Palace's turnover was 200 million pounds, it'd have 140 million, and you have to fold your player salaries into that particular level of salary overall cost. It still means you can pay players 500 grand a week if you want to, but then you have to pay other players 10,000 pounds a week. You'd have to factor in a reasonable lifespan, which is look at the average contract term of a player in an average football club in, say, the Premier League is probably 24 months. So if you've got 20 players on your 25 players on your books, some have 4-year contracts, some have 1-year contracts, and you've got an average contract value of 2 years, it wouldn't be inappropriate to turn around and say, right, we introduce salary caps within 2 years. So in 2 years' time, you have enough time to trade player contracts in and out to get yourself into a situation where you know that your turnover is somewhere between 150 to 200 million or 400 million to 500 million, and then you have a 70% salary cap on that basis. Now, the flip side to the argument is salary caps potentially stops investment. There's an alternative view, which means you can get into progressive taxation, where you start to tax football clubs on the basis of their additional spend, so that you generate revenue into the infrastructure of football. Because the big thing about salary caps and controlling costs is that it's an ecosystem that's affecting everybody. The more people spend at the top, the more it drips down to the bottom. And the reasons why there needs to be control is to protect the ecosystem, not for Man City and Liverpool, but for all the clubs in the bottom half of the Premier League, in the Championship, in League One and League Two. So I think there's a variety of ways of doing it, but I think it could be done in under 3 years, and certainly in 2. I think it could be done by introducing salary caps at 70%, but also alongside progressive taxation, where if people want to spend a lot of money, they get taxed, they get levied. So if you're spending £50 million on transfer fees, you pay a 3% levy. If you're spending 75%, you pay a 5% levy. If you want to spend beyond 100 million, then you pay a 15% levy, and it goes into the food chain to be able to feed the other parts of the system. And you could do the same similarly with the salaries. So if you want to pay higher salaries, you tax them so that it feeds the system. So I'd look at progressive taxation alongside salary caps as a solution to the financial situation landscape that the PSGs, Man Cities, Chelseas and possibly Newcastles have brought to the game. Okay, that's it for this week's edition of One to One with Simon Jordan. Let me know your views on Chelsea, Newcastle and player salary caps. Keep on leaving your questions in the comment section below, and of course, keep liking and subscribing.